Wow, that was wow.
Just to make sure everyone knows, okay?
So this is going to be a very informal session, a very small, cozy room. So welcome to the this afternoon, late afternoon session of where we're going to discuss the business of Earth observation. My name is Luca Budello, and I lead on geospatial at Innovate UK KTN, and I will co-host this session together with my colleague Dan Wicks from the satellite application Catapult. When I was researching for this session, it came to me that I never see the first picture that was taken from space. Does any one of you know when the first picture taken from space was that one? You can Google it, by the way. And that's what I did. I Googled it. I thought it was interesting. So I found out that a group of American scientists mounted a 35mm camera on top of a V2 ballistic rocket on October 1946. The war was just finished, and the technology was acquired from the German, and they thought to send a camera into space. And they took this picture, which you can see on the internet, which is very blurry. You can see the curvature of the Earth. And I thought it was interesting. And well, 70 years on, we came a long way. Now we have probably 5,000 satellites up in space, many of which sending petabytes of data on a daily basis down to Earth. Despite 70 years of technology development, I think the Earth observation industry is still quite young. We have not yet figured out a way to move from the technology-driven innovation phase towards a market-driven approach, which will make our industry more mature. And that being that it's much easier to solve challenges related to sending payload to space rather than resolve the business models that power and make the industry be more mature. So today we're going to talk about the business of Earth observation. There is a lot of opportunity in the sector. We're going to look at the opportunities, at the trends, but also challenges and blockers. This session is divided in two parts. The first part, we're going to have 4 speakers. Each speaker will have about 10-12 minutes for their presentation, where they're going to put forward a number of case studies, a number of things they've been working on around this subject. And then I will pass on the baton to Dan, where he's going to host an informal session, a conversation, where he will ask questions to all of us, and we can pitch in. So be ready to pitch in your ideas around the topic of business of Earth observation. Now, without further ado, our first speaker is Jason Hopkins. Jason is a senior innovation and research scientist at Ordnance Survey. His current work focuses on combining geospatial and Earth observation data to unlock insight and solve customer challenges. He has a PhD in oceanography and a previous experience at NASA. In this talk, he will talk about the value of collaboration, particularly between academia and industry, to improve user access to climate data. Jason? I forgot Mike Perry as well, because I didn't have it. Mike will also do a double act here, please.
Thank you. So, yeah, we're going to do a bit of a double act here. So, okay.
I can just go through the slides until that happens, John. Can we go to the next slide?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay, brilliant. So Mike and I are going to talk about a project we ran together, our organisations, looking at how we can make climate data, Earth observation data more accessible to the general public. As I said, I'm Jason Hopkins. I'm a Senior Innovation Research Scientist at Ordnance Survey. And usually the first question we get asked is, why Ordnance Survey? Because you do maps, don't you? And yes, we do maps. That's what we're known for. But primarily, we're a geospatial data organisation. Maps is a small proportion of our income, but it's what we get recognised for. So we shouldn't underestimate it, but it is a small proportion of what we do. We're a geospatial data organisation. What we have got We've got a customer base of there's probably more than that now, probably about 5,200 public sector organisations that take our data via something called the Public Sector Geospatial Agreement. So we have this huge customer base of government bodies that we can tap into. We also have international aspirations. So typically we will take our mapping expertise to governments and other international bodies around the world that might not have a mature mapping capability. So again, another huge customer base that we can exploit. So what did we do with the heat data? So what we recognized was there's this really interesting Earth observation data out there, climate data out there, but we recognized that there typically are some blockers to uptake of this data. We wanted to understand what they were. So what we did, we worked with NCO, who created the data for us, and our data scientists created a website. And we invited some of our public sector customers to come in and access that website. In order to do that, they had to answer a few questions: who they were, what they might want to use the data for, how they're going to use it. And then we followed that up afterwards with a conversation with them to understand what were the problems with this and what were the challenges. We didn't just dump the data on them and give it to them willy-nilly. We gave them a few use cases, primarily based on our geospatial data that they could use the data for. And then they got that feedback from them. So I'm going to hand over to Mike now, who's going to talk about the data.
Thanks, Tracy. So I'm Mike Perry at University of Leicester NCO, and what we were mainly looking to do here was to give accurate, easily available, robust data to Ordnance Survey, where they could then distribute it to users and use these case studies. So one of the issues we have is getting good quality data out at the resolution that people are interested in. What, from my perspective, is high resolutions. We're talking 90 to 100 meters here. Now, we had to develop these products because there's no robust way to do this that's currently in operation. So this was a spin out of our ongoing activities that we've been doing at the University of Leicester for some time. And what we're looking at here was bringing in Landsat. So many of you will be familiar with Landsat, but Landsat essentially is looking at around 100 meters thermally. But one of the big issues we found, especially outside the US, where they do have some analysis ready data, is that there isn't consistent methodologies and consistent data sets that can be used in scientific research. So we took the Landsat data and had to derive a robust methodology that was scientifically traceable, with well-constrained uncertainties, and with all the rigor that we applied to climate quality data sets in many initiatives, but to make sure that it was available at the high resolution scales, and also that there was full traceability. So you could have both the ease of the data, but also the accuracy and robustness that people who are used to climate data expect. So I'm not going to go through a huge amount of what's here, but they're in the slides, as we've only got a short amount of time to go through it. Essentially, we wanted a process that was repeatable and also location independent. So we went with an optimal estimation approach, where we used an iterative approach to take large scale data such as model reanalysis atmospheres, land classification, and combine them with Landsat so that you could do this anywhere on the globe. You wouldn't need ancillary data, you don't need songs, you don't need a campaign data to go along with it, and in theory making it intercomparable, which is a big problem in a lot of urban studies. So we've got the land surface temperature, which is the basic product that our optimal estimation regime produces, and anyone can ask me more about that if they want. Then we needed to convert it into other things the users might find useful. So the first and most obvious metric, if you're looking at urban areas, which is where a lot of our case studies were located, urban heat island. So the urban heat island is the increase in temperature that you'd see in an area based on the fact that there's a city there. So essentially, it's if you had a rural background, a region with no development, this would have one temperature, and we've increased that by adding the urban environment through materials, through the anthropogenic heating. And this is a measure of how much the anthropogenic influences have increased the temperature. Essentially, to do this, you need to isolate a background site, and you simply subtract this from the whole region, and that gives you that amplification due to the urban environment. A fairly simple metric, but quite hard to implement in a robust manner. So this is an example of urban heat over London, and it has the features you'd expect. As you go towards the more industrial commercial areas, you see a higher urban heat island. Rivers obviously come out as negative because they're colder than the rural background. So the third metric that we provided on the survey was a measure of thermal comfort. This is exponentially harder, and it's one of the areas where we're really pushing to involve with other people to work out what we're doing here. So this essentially is going to a feels like temperature. So if you use a weather app, you'll get one temperature, which is the temperature of the air around you. You'll also get one which is the feels like. And for most health impacts, which a lot of people who are wanting this data will be aware, the feels like is what often drives heat risk, mortality, these kind of things. So we had to come up with a methodology that would implement here, and the most robust one we could work with was this Thom discomfort index, which again, I'm happy to talk to people about this. But again, we added on top of the land surface temperature and the urban heat island, this third dimension of discomfort index, all packaged together in the same data that had all the uncertainties and traceability that we could then give to Ordnance Survey. And this is just an idea of what a discomfort index looks like. It's a bit different to your normal classifications, as they're banded into slightly more subjective terms like cool, comfortable, hot, timid, torrid, not timid. And these are the terms that are more useful when you're issuing health alerts, these kind of things. And that was also provided with this data. And as you can see, we did many different locations across the UK and then handed all of this data back off to Ordnance Survey. And I'll hand back to Jason.
So what did we find from this? We talked to around about 300 people after this, 300 customers who were using this data. And, you know, I think these statistics sort of speak for themselves. 88% of them thought this data would be really useful, but only 15% of them actually use the data. So there's a reason for that. And one of the reasons is this is what we gave them. We didn't know to make it look pretty or anything like that. We gave them the heat data. This is what it looks like. And so we had a number of feedback on this. You know, what does it mean? How do we use it? I can't download it. I don't know what format it needs to be in. You know, all these things, they were all blockers to the use of this data. They're quite simple things. So we had this conversation with them. Here's the data. What would make it useful? We put it on a map. And once you put that on a map, then it starts becoming useful to people. They can start looking at it. There's context behind it. Seems really simple, but this is what we did. We also used that with some of our vector data. Once you start putting vector data on it, you can start doing geospatial analytics on it. So it wasn't really rocket science in its true form, but I think it demonstrates just the value of putting geospatial data with Earth observation data. I coined this phrase at work, which people are getting really bored of now, but geo unlocks EO. Geospatial unlocks the value of Earth observation data. So the number of recommendations in the report. First one is we recommended that, you know, the data is provided under the FAIR strategy. Second one really is about time series. This was critical for some of our customers. Being able to go back in time, be able to look at trends in the data, allows them to then maybe do some forecasting moving forward. Talking about actually accessing the data, there was a kind of even split really about how customers wanted to use the data. Some of them were quite happy with APIs, getting the data out that way. Some people wanted bulk downloads. We can provide both through our Data Hub platform. Certain organizations really saw the value of getting a bit more granular with that linking up of the geospatial data, bringing it down to that UPRN, a unique property reference number. Each property in the UK has a reference number. Can we link that data down to that property level? We recommended that we go forward now and operationalize this. The only blocker we've got at the moment is how it's funded. And also there's a really requirement for some training so people can actually start using this more effectively. That's it, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, we have time for a question or two. Does anyone in the audience, the gentleman over there, if you like to tell your name?
Do you want me to stand up?
Please.
I think everyone can see me. So the Landsat data, what was the temporal resolution? The one that you were showing is a composite, isn't it?
No, so those were single scenes, so those would have been for a specific day there.
Okay.
You generally, with the Landsat 16-day repeat cycle, so that is one of the limitations. Working further with OS, though, we're looking at bringing in other data sources to augment it temporarily.
Okay, so if there is a cloud presence, it catches up.
Yeah, cloud just has to be completely flagged out at the moment, and so the scenes that we presented to OS were cloud-free to the best of our knowledge. In the UK, it's impossible to say 100%, but yeah, so this was done with cloud-free data, as this was put out to users to see what they would like. But yeah.
Okay, last question, yes?
Just a quick one. Was there any pushback in terms of where you set your parameters for your sort of qualitative statements around hot and torrid? I just wonder whether policymakers in government were just a little bit anxious about.
We didn't give them hot and torrid, to be perfectly honest with you, because that probably wouldn't have made an awful, like you say, we probably would have got pushback from it. I think, again, that's a conversation that needs to be had. How do you best want this data presented? What's going to be those important metrics that you need to want us to filter out from you? Because it's not necessarily really, again, about the data. It's sometimes what we find is we're sort of giving this data to a variety of expertise. Some people have their own geospatial departments. Some people are quite happy using Earth observation data. Other places, they've never even seen Earth observation data before. So it's understanding that sweet spot about how we get that data into a format that they can actually lift up and use for what they want to actually use it for.
Thank you very much. We move on to our second speaker, UKE02022. Got it right, fortunately. Chi has a background in environmental science, remote sensing and GIS, with post held with Earth-I and IC before joining Orbital Insight, a solution engineer. In his talk, will look at what, where, and when how changes are happening on Earth. Please, the stage is yours.
Cheers. Thanks. Great to be back at a physical conference again. I'm tired of sitting down to sleep. So, there we go. So I'm Shi. Nice to meet you all. I'm a solutions engineer at Orbital Insight, and I basically work very closely between the sales and engineering teams at the organization. And as I said, my background is remote sensing GIS, and yeah, it's really good to be here again. So for those of you who have never heard of us, maybe some of you have. A long time ago, we came up with this product looking at floating tank lids. That was about 7-8 years ago now. We've moved on a little bit since. So we're currently led by our CEO, Kevin O'Brien, founded by James Crawford, who was our previous CEO. We're funded by Sequoia and Google, and our partners include Planet, Airbus, and most recently Esri as well. So just a slide on to talk about how there are a lot of different issues in the world right now, a lot of intricate and complex webs of interaction. And I think one of the things that we want to do at Orbital is to really shed some light on some of those really complex interactions, looking at not just satellite data, but other alternative sources of data as well that's collected from the ground. And that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit more on and give some examples of later in my slides. So essentially how Orbital works is we work around our platform called GO. And GO will take in, it's data agnostic. It takes in different types of data. We have satellite data from imagery, SAR, but today I'll be touching on just geolocation data. So what do you mean by geolocation data? So it's data collected from anonymized data, collected from phone pings, it could be connected cars as well, and even connected rail. We've got a data science team and a CV team at the organization, and they will work together with the customer, along with myself, and then we can create things like indications, warnings, facility warnings, monitoring, and patterns of life. So without actually doing a live demo, essentially what we do in the platform is you put in an area of interest, you select a particular algorithm. In here, this one here, we've got foot traffic, for example, and I'll talk more about that later. You define a period of a time of interest, we call it, and then you use that and you create a project within the platform, you run it, and then it produces some results. You can do it again and again until you find something interesting and normally that you want to dive deeper into. So it provides a really simple, fast, and flexible workflow in which to create your projects and to run your analyses. On that note, we're currently in the process of transitioning Go into a 2.0 sort of platform. There's a name for it, I'm not going to say it here. And that allows customers and users to bring not just their own data, but if they have their own algorithms as well to run on our platform. In the platform, there's also a Jupyter Lab interface where users can run their own analysis, output their own bespoke reports, for example. So these are the various types of data sets that we have in our platform at the moment. So for geolocation, we've got cell phones, or you call ad tech. We've got ships from AIS, both from satellite and terrestrial sources. We have ADS-B from aircraft. It was quite interesting looking at Boris Johnson's lab, Balmoral, this morning on the I think it was one of the websites looking at aircraft ADS-B data. We've got connected vehicles, both passenger and commercial trucks. So these data types will allow us to do things like activity and heat map analysis, traceability and movement analysis, and those are the 2 points there that I will talk a little bit more about later. And then, of course, the high-res satellite that we've always had in SkySat, we've got Pleiades, looking to bring on Airbus Neo at some point, and we've recently also brought on SatLogic. So these will allow us to do the CV, computer vision sort of stuff, looking at vehicles, detecting aircraft and ships and rail cars. And then we have the always-on constellation of Planet Delft as well, and we use that primarily for land use classification. So many different types of data sets, and I'll show some examples later of some of that coming together. So I thought it'd be fun to run a project on where we are right now. I'm not exactly sure when Space Park Leicester started to be constructed, but as you can see, there was a very flat line sometime between May, January 2020 and about May 2021, which coincides with the pandemic. And for those of us who are football fans here, I'm not a Leicester City football fan myself. Arsenal, just in case you wanted to know. There's a flat line as well, similar, that coincides in where lockdown started and when you started to see the first football matches coming back to live gaming. Yeah. So now into a more business sort of focused analysis. So during the lockdown, we looked at sort of back to the factory operations for US auto plants in the US. And we were asking questions like, how are auto manufacturers handling the COVID crisis? Which ones are ramping up production and how quickly are they ramping up their production? Were there additional shutdowns after the initial first lockdown? So we looked at various of these manufacturing plants across the states, and on the left, on the white area, you can see normal sort of activity levels. And then for some, you'll see it goes down because of lockdown, and then they sort of kind of creep up again. But for others, they sort of stay flat. Like for example, the one right at the bottom right, second from the right. So it's quite interesting to see the variability of the auto plants come back to life again. So at Orbital, we're really focused on two things: facility monitoring and site intelligence. You might be asking, so what's the difference between the two? It's a good question. I asked myself that question up to about a few weeks ago, actually, I'll be honest. So facility monitoring is really looking at a facility in isolation and maybe just areas around it, understanding things like foot traffic, number of people coming and going. And then the other area that we're looking at is really site intelligence. So understanding an area of interest, but understanding the relationships of that particular area of interest with the other areas of interest, for example, where devices have come from and where they go to. Interesting use case for supply chain. And so very quickly, foot traffic. So we count devices within an area of interest over a period of time. And that, of course, can be used as a proxy for activity of factories, as I've shown earlier. And apart from just being able to derive a graph of that foot traffic over time, we're able also to create what we call heat maps of where those high areas, high footfall areas are within a particular area of interest. Here's an example of London, a macro example. So looking at these blue areas is where the main arteries of travel are. You get a lot of high foot traffic. I think those are roads. And then looking down on a sort of like more local level, understanding, for example, in a busy shopping area, where's the areas of highest footfall? And that's maybe for a particular customer looking at advertising. It'll be an interesting bit of data set to see whether or not having a billboard here would be where they get the most exposure. So the next one that I'm going to touch on is traceability. So traceability sort of builds on foot traffic in that it looks at areas of interest to see where devices come from and go to, but also to see the logistical relationships of factories and suppliers, and distribution centers. So there's one output of that. So you can see all the blue lines is actually where devices were coming from before they arrived at the AOI. If I were to click that off, I don't have an image of that, but you've got the red ones. They also show you where those devices subsequently go to after leaving a particular area of interest. So I'm just going to very quickly go through 3 use cases here. This one's on site expansion and planning. So in this particular case, we were trying to help the customer. The customer's problem was to optimize raw material collection because they had very limited visibility and understanding of what's happening on the ground. It was quite risky for them to pick new sites for raw material collection. So what we essentially helped them with was we studied foot traffic patterns around the location, the sites, to understand where farmers come from. And then from that, we actually found that around 80% of trips were from these 4 particular villages in the area. And so the benefit for that for the customer was, they had a better idea of that first mile of that supply chain. And also you got more informed intelligence on where the new sites can come from. Secondly is an ESG sustainable sourcing use case. So the questions that from the customer was, am I sourcing my raw materials and supplies ethically? Are there any sort of sustainability leakage in my supply chain? And so what we did was we mapped it out again using, I think, both traceability and foot traffic. And we brought in also, in addition to geolocation data, imagery as well to help corroborate some of the data that we had. And so the benefit, again, was that they had a better visibility into that first mile of suppliers. I think the last one is probably my favorite because this was actually for theme parks, 2 really, really big theme parks that I will not name. Say they wanted a clear picture of their guest behavior when they are not at park facilities. So where do their guests go after or before they leave a park? Because they were missing customer loyalty expansion opportunities. And so our solution was to use Go again to understand that activity using traceability, to get foot traffic, and then mapping out these competitive facilities as well so that they understand where the competitors' customers were coming and going. And so you could build a better regional map to understand those regional opportunities for the customer. So if you look there on the right in that graph, you actually see that they outpaced their competitor, but in 2 occasions, they lagged behind. So that was quite an interesting observation that they themselves didn't know before. And so that benefit to them was improved knowledge of their own customers, but also the competitors' customers. So to conclude, we have the Go platform. It's currently moving on to 2.0. It's data agnostic. Allows customers to bring on their own algos as well as their own data. We're focusing on 2 main topics at the moment, looking at facility monitoring and site intelligence. And the last thing that I want to mention is that we're very open to partnerships. We realize we can't do everything ourselves. And that's where we hope as well that Go 2.0 will help facilitate some of those relationships. In the words of Geo, Earth observation is space-based or remotely sensed data as well as ground-based or in-situ data. So hopefully some of the examples I've shown you today will help paint a more colorful picture of what's going on Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Steve, is there any question from the audience? Do we have any questions? Please.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, Go is already operational, right?
Sorry?
So the platform, it's already operational.
Yes, it's been around for about 3 years now.
Yes. So how, out of curiosity, how do you charge? Is it by?
It's by a credit system. So we allocate a certain chunk of credits, and then you draw down from that credit. So every time you want a little bit more, you can always just.
And the type of partnerships that you're looking for is providing with the satellite data?
No, it's well beyond. I mean, it's looking at certain expertise in areas that we don't have. Like I said, we can't do everything. If there's for example, deforestation or some of these things that we perhaps don't do as well as we should. We would like to have those partnerships, or for example, thermal data, which we don't currently have. That's a very interesting proposition for some of our customers. If we can work together with these companies, I think they'll provide a lot of value for the end customer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a quick one, I probably missed that point, but what's the foot traffic data was coming from? What was the data that you were collecting?
So a lot of the foot traffic data is coming from ad tech data. So ad tech data is actually data that comes from apps on our phones. And so that will have location information, but also from, for example, connected cars. Those connected cars these days will have some locational information as well. And so that's another
They're not
source.
public data, of course, you have access to them.
No, it's not public data, no. But for ADSB, for example, that's available publicly as well, yeah.
On this respect, I have a question as well, because using mobile phone data within what a data fusion environment, which is what you created to manage the database and analyze all these different type of data. I wonder what you do, what are the processes to make sure that you trust the data that you use and that you communicate to the end user that the intelligence provided is trustworthy?
Right, that's a good question. A very important question as well, because privacy, we all know it's a big issue, and we actually do have an ethics committee within the organization that oversees, for example, with the pings that come from your mobile phone, we will not allow ourselves to display any information, or it will not be logged on map unless there are at least 2 to 3 devices. So we will never trace one device alone. And often they're all aggregated data anyway. So, you will not be able to trace the individual, and increasingly with geolocation data, the device pings, which, allocates a device ID to a certain mobile phone, gets rotated over time. And so after a while, all that gets wiped away. And so in terms of privacy, well, it's all very well protected.
All right, thank you very much, Steve.
Pleasure.
Round of applause. Our next speaker, if I manage to make use of the technology here, is Ed Briney and Jordan Lindsay. Ed is the business innovation lead for the space commercialization engine, and Jordan is the sustainability coordinator at Minviro. They will talk about how to deliver not just deliver insight, but also revenue in non-space sector.
Thanks, Luca. So we haven't rehearsed this at all, and myself and Jordan are doing a two-hander with lots of getting up and getting down. So I'm down here. That's not me. It's just
Let's keep going.
There we go. So we're going to focus on the SCU, which is the Space Commercialization Engine. We're based here in Leicester, but we're a national program. We're an EO-focused accelerator. So a very simplistic goal for us is to get businesses to market where EO is an important component of their overall offer. So that can be EO going into a new product, a new service, or an existing product, existing service. It's very much about supporting, well, it seems to have been very much about supporting non-space businesses. Our scope is Earth observation. We're here for any UK company, any UK registered company at all. The program itself delivers a prototype or a proof of concept. So there are 4 different stages to the program that I'll go into. There is business strategy support that's provided, and typically we're looking at a 6-month duration for the full program itself. There is contribution required from a business, so we look at about £100,000 worth of value that we're providing to a business, and there's a percentage of that that we look for in terms of a cash contribution from the business as well as an in-kind contribution. So most importantly, that we get people and even the end users, which is a very important part of this, involved in whatever it is that's going to be built. So there are 4 stages to the program itself. Stage 1, concept generation. Stage 2, technical investigation. So the concept generation, mixture of technical and business in terms of, is there a market for whatever it is that we're looking to co-create? Who is the competition? Where does the business sit? What does the business need in terms of funding? There's 9 different stages with regards to that scoping. We then get to stage 2, which is a technical investigation, very much academic based in terms of problem solution with regards to EO. Does it answer what the question is? So that's about 8 weeks or so that we spend on stage 2. Stage 3 is the prototype delivery. So turning that into something that a startup business or an SME can either take to investors to say, there we go, we're proving that actually the technology works and the EO answers our solution. Or even it's a case of you might have something that's very close to a proof of concept and then towards production if you're looking at putting something into an existing system. Stage 4 is commercialization, which actually starts at stage 1 and runs all the way through in terms of what is the roadmap for the business, what is the roadmap for the product line, and working through that. So that whole program lasts about 6 months or so. So clearly I'm here supporting this program, but it was much easier if I relied on Jordan, who's actually going through the program with us at the moment, to talk about what they're doing. So this is the 200.
Oh, thank you, Ed. Yeah, so I'm Jordan. I work with Enviro. We are a London-based sustainability company, and we use life cycle assessment to quantify environmental impacts related to the production of a given product or a process. And we focus on the raw material sector. So that can be anything from a mine, the production of a kilo of copper, all the way downstream to the production of electric vehicle batteries with raw materials. So life cycle assessment is a robust and globally recognized way to quantify environmental impacts using data. So it's not just ESG, making plans to do stuff to save the environment, it's actually using data to do quantitative insights into what impacts are related to a product. And as you can see, as I said, from mine site all the way to final production of a product, life cycle assessment looks at every bit of energy consumed to make your product, every material you use, every direct emission which might be emitted, and we quantify all of this. So it connects to our background database, and we can provide impacts over a range of categories. Obviously, the most popular one is CO2 equivalent, so climate change impact, but we also look at things like acidification, particulate emissions, eutrophication, radiation, things like that. And our sort of business idea is that people usually know what they want to solve, but they don't have the quantitative insights to actually tackle climate change or tackle environmental impacts that they may be incurring by making their product. And it helps guide them towards making sustainable choices when they're making their products. As a business, we have a consultancy branch and a technology branch, so usually our consultants work with companies and quantify their environmental impacts and kind of work with them closely to sort of develop environmental or sustainable roadmaps. But we also have Mine LCA, which is our software, which embeds all this knowledge and embeds all our raw material data insights into technology that people can use to generate LCA values by themselves. So where the SCE comes in is that as a company, we are really focused on the highest quality data possible so that our insights that we're given are accurate for a given process, a given product, an asset, a very specific region of the world. And some of the outputs that we look at, particularly land transformation and water use impact, are very reliant on the region of operation. So where is that place? And the main factors we're looking at for these 2 impact categories within the LCA are how is the land transforming while you're making a product at a mine or facility, and what is the water use impact that you're having, especially in relation to how scarce water is in that region. So if you're making a product in Scotland where it rains all the time, or you're making a product in the middle of the Atacama Desert, it's obviously going to have a bigger impact there in terms of water scarcity. So with the SCE, we applied for this, and we've been working closely with them since May, I think. And we're currently in phase 3, so we went through all the sort of analysis process, we've developed the prototype, and we're now looking at embedding the results of the land and water impacts into our tools so that users can actually define a region of the world and get LCA impacts accurate for their region. So the first thing we did was we looked at the land transformation. So if you imagine a mine being created, you're going to get rid of a bunch of vegetated land, forestry, grassland, everything like that, and plonk a mine on top of it. And what our tool is aiming to and quantify the environmental impact of doing this for a host of different impacts like biotic reproduction related to sort of biotic activity in soil, the amount of water filtration, the amount of physical chemical filtration in the water systems. And previously we did this quite subjectively. We just looked at where the mine was going to be in the world and what was going to turn into and sort of quantified it that way, which when I just said that we're trying to do everything very objectively and science driven isn't very good. So what we've developed with SCE is that we've plugged satellite Earth observation data into this. If you imagine this as a site that's looking at this, it's automatically detecting the land classification for the site. The yellow is grassland, there's some forest land, and there's some wetland here. It quantifies how much of the area is attributed to each impact category, and then it transforms this into an industrial area. What is the impact of getting rid of all this grassland and turning it into an industrial site or a mineral extraction site? And this has all been automated through this fantastic work that SCE has done for us. And yeah, it's accurate, very accurate. You can see all the pictures here. Previously, we would have just said that that was all grassland and calculated it that way, but this has just improved our data quality immeasurably. With the water one, it's quite similar. So again, as I said, if you're going to be producing a product and you're using water to create that product, the impact on the environment varies as a function of how scarce water is in that region. And for the water part of the SCE project, it's taken this Google Maps layer, which is called the aware factor, which is again something we'd have calculated manually and tried to draw all these water values and how scarce water is in that location. But now from the sort of the code that the SCE has developed for us, the users will just put in where their facility is with a longitude and latitude, and all this information will be directly available. So when they're calculating water impact, it's accurate for that specific asset, and it's actually quite granular. There's boundaries between specific water catchment areas and things like that. So it really does, the final impact is very heavily dependent on the region, and it's quite tight, this map. So again, through the SCE, we've been able to add this extra layer of data quality into our analysis. The next step, this looks pretty complicated, I'm not going to lie, I don't know anything about EO data, that's why we've done this program, but this is basically adding all this Python code that's been, all these clever things that SCE have done for us using EO data and plugging it into our existing software. And that's what all that means basically. So we're kind of here in the process, we're kind of approaching the final stage. It's pretty exciting seeing it all taking shape. If anyone wants to see our software, I've got my laptop and I can show you. It doesn't have the EO stuff, but hopefully it will show you sort of in general what the interface looks like and what people that are using environmental insights for raw material projects can gain from doing LCA. But essentially, the SCE has given us something that we would never have been able to do ourselves. Our team is all geologists, and although it seems like we should know about EO data, many of us don't. So it's been fantastic to be involved with this, and it's like genuine experts have helped us add, yes, extra layer to our software that sort of puts us ahead of our competitors, but also it's sort of making the things that we'd be able to do very sort of iteratively in a consultancy project on a sort of basis by basis. It's actually in our software now, so that sort of the specificity that is gained by these regional insights is embedded in our tool now. So it's been very valuable to be part of it. Yeah, and the next steps are going to be commercializing, hopefully, because our software is currently out, and we're just going to be adding this function in. That's us. Thank you.
That's really a very nice piece of work. Any question from the audience? Donna.
I have one. Who owns the code? Do you own the code? The IP?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think the idea is that there's the land and water use are two cases where regional inputs would be put into the LCA to add an extra layer of data, but there's a lot of things to do with maybe any sort of area of land that's transforming, not necessarily to make industrial sites, but maybe there's some other applications of just like an area of land and the impact on that. We're hoping to sort of spread out other things that we do in the LCA, because there are, as I said, the region of operation is quite a sensitive input to the final impact results. So anything that involves this sort of dependency on where the project is taking place and what water is like in that region, what's the sort of land coverage is like, we're hoping to sort of spread out a lot of the other things that we do.
How do you deal with the fact that I'm assuming from the non-EO data, the source must vary quite a lot depending on where you're looking in the world. Like what data is available, what form that data comes in, how do you make them intercomparable?
For the life cycle impact or for the EO parts?
I know for the life cycle impact, so I assume the
Yeah.
EO part can be standardized to a
Yeah.
degree, but all the other stuff like the electricity,
Yeah.
like how do you reconcile that when countries report them so
So
differently?
we purchase life cycle impact data from commercial databases, and for any raw materials, we conduct the life cycle assessments to ISO standards ourselves. So generally for electricity, those are published and sort of like fuel impacts, but for anything that's like lithium, nickel, any sort of raw materials, we generally just conduct LCs internally to the same system that the commercial databases use, and it's sort of standardized within the same practice.
Please. How do you validate your EO output, your derived products for your land classification?
So we're hoping to initially sort of run the manual calculations side by side. So the two methodologies are called WANCA for the land use, the land transformation, and AWARE for the water use side of things. So we've sort of done validation where SCA have developed automation, and we've sort of done each one manually side by side, and they came out with very similar answers, which is good. And we'll probably need to sort of integrate this further for when it's commercialized to kind of make sure that it's not going to sort of deviate from that path. But I guess that will be part of stage 3 when we're sort of working out commercialization. But generally, as with anything with any of our technologies, we generally can do manual LCAs that the consultants would do side by side and then validate the results against each other. Because we're using the same databases for consultancy that the technology links to. It just might be user inputs that might vary in terms of it might not be the right units or it might not be normalized correctly, but usually we sort of read that out by doing it manually side by side.
One last question.
Yeah, to the SCE engine people. So do you have to go through that whole process, those 4 stages? Or if you already have a demonstrator project, it's the sort of prototype, would you jump in?
Well, we can talk about it after. It's a modular accelerator, but it depends where the individual is. We've worked with startups and we've worked with SMEs over the last year or so, and the SCE is much better positioned to support SMEs. The Catapult has other programs for startups. There could be something in particular with regards to startup with their idea where the SCE would support. Typically, we support SMEs that have platforms already and have revenue of some form or other. Because it's a 6-month program and there's significant investment from the Catapult in it. But happy to have a chat.
Thank you. Thank you, Jordan. Our last speaker, Richard Britton, is the founder of Alsys. He has 20 years of experience working in development, collaborating with government, donors, and research organizations to provide solutions and often working in policy. We'll talk about, I don't know if he has changed his presentation, but talk about the conflict observatory, which was established in support of the Ukrainian war. Richard?
Thank you, Luca. That is a change to the published schedule. I was going to talk about the use of satellite imagery
We are.
in the conflict observatory in terms of monitoring atrocities in Ukraine, but that program hasn't advanced as sufficiently as I'd hoped. So altered the subject matter now just to talk more about some public sector use of the work that they do. So in the interest of me better understanding my audience, can I ask a rather pertinent question? Feel free to not answer the question, but are there any civil servants in the room here? With the exception of Ordnance Survey and UK Space Agency. Okay, I can go and sit down now. This is my point. They're just not in the room, right? So why not? So what I want to do is race through a number of the challenge areas. Jason, you touched on some of them earlier, and I might repeat some of them as I go through it. And it's a bit of a canter. It's a bit of a cynical take after 20 years of working in the public sector, trying to get servants to use EO and GEO in the programs that they use. I'll give you an example. At the moment, we are all paying over £11 billion this year for overseas development assistance. Quite a controversial figure. But we don't know how much Earth observation data is being consumed in that budget. But I can assure you it's going to be a tiny, tiny fraction, and probably even less than you might imagine it to be. So why not? Why isn't it more? Because if you're going to be delivering programs in overseas countries, doing all the things that people have been advocating today and will be for the next couple of days, there's no reason why we shouldn't be. So I'll try and keep these comments quite high. There will be exceptions to them, but I want to put more emphasis on the threats than the opportunities, because I think we're all here. We know what many of these opportunities are. It's more the blockers that are the issues. I want to cover these 5 areas. So, okay, better data. So more satellites in space. What does that mean? More resolutions of data, temporary, spectral, and all manner of data. We've just been talking about those. So to give you an example of my world, yesterday, 3 different project calls. The sorts of things we're collecting imagery for: floods, droughts, crop mapping, yields, coal mining, going back to mapping coal and extraction and exporting, border hardening, border crossing points, trade flows. That's on the licit side. On the illicit side, we're looking at opium cultivation, eradication, drug labs, drug trading facilities, cross-border facilitation, crystal meth, labs, bazaars, exports, human trafficking, hallmark points, the movement locations, the canalization, and cross-border movement of those. To cite just several. Now, we can get EO for all of that, and we're faced with an agony of choice now, as we were yesterday speculating which indicators, which imagery do we want to use to collect what indicators at what resolution? 30, 40, 50 centimeters. It's quite a big price differential in those. And so as these revolutions of price come through, how does that change our business models? It's quite profound. But it's a phenomenal opportunity. And as Jason was saying earlier, there's a real issue of access. So we want to try and get this stuff into the civil service, into our clients. At the end of the project we're talking to them about, I say to them, I'm going to give you a load of imagery. I'm going to give you a load of geospatial data. Volumes of data, I have systems that can receive it, handle it, manage it. I'll start breaking into a sweat. No, thank you. I'll get a report and I'll have a PDF, thanks very much. And we just really missed the opportunity of getting access to the data of these people who are making strategic and important decisions without the ability to get into it. I also talk about pointillism. You know, we're at the point where people are excited to get a bit of a satellite image with a few points on it, and that's fantastic. And, you know, we really need to move beyond that. Better models, lots of talk about that, and will be, you know, that is the future. We want, you know, more data extracted from more imagery at greater pace, at greater depth. I just gave a talk in the other session about SDGs and looking at measuring change. You know, this is post-demining by the UN and what's happened as a consequence. You can see immediately transformative. How do we measure that? So the models are coming to allow us. I mean, they're there, but they're not really where we want them to be. But they're coming. We know that. But what are the requirements for these models? Because we kind of think we know, you know, we need to do some building footprint models, or we want to do some road models. But I come back to my horse here and quality, because we're always working at this end here. We're on this level of quality, right? The models that we produce. But yeah, often, you know, we're kind of, when you pull them apart, actually they're kind of down here. They're not really there yet. They're kind of down there. And then some of them are really down there. But many of us don't know, actually, until you get the outputs and test them, really whether those models are really as well developed as they should be. But equally in the operational space, as opposed to the academic domain, where should you set your quality tolerance? Because if you're going to put it there, that's very expensive. And who's going to pay for that? If you set it there, is that good enough? So where's that good enough threshold? Don't know, not yet developed. So on from better models, better analytics. Okay, so more improved understanding. So we've been talking about that too. You were talking just now about, you know, those outputs you can get as you integrate all of these different data sets. And so, and importantly, that data from the ground. So this is our report we released for the Foreign Office 2 months ago. It was reported by the FT 3 times with 3 different perspectives on it. We're talking about governance, we're talking about coal mining, we're talking about freedom of movement, all from one report. And it was done so because underpinning that is at least probably 200 satellite images that we collected and analysed and integrated into a diagnostic tool that has allowed us to come up with something that's quite an unpalatable result, which is that actually the Taliban government in Afghanistan is a far more effective government than the previous one. That's not particularly open news. But the evidence screams that, and so we have to communicate it. But there's a truth to power dimension there. You know, often people don't want to know that. And as much of an opportunity the satellite imagery is that we can see it plain as day, these changes, and whether they're positive or negative, you can't deny that. The policy world often hasn't caught up with that potential embarrassment. And in the policy world, it's often easier to kill the messenger than it is to do something about the very thing that's at issue. But the thing that concerns me equally is this ground truth. If you go back 5 years, 10 years ago, it was much more expensive to get a satellite image over a location than it was to get a field survey team into that location. It's flipped now. It's much more expensive to get boots on the ground than it is an image. And it's so quite seductive, isn't it, to say, well, you know, okay, we can see stuff from space. So let's reduce the bit of budget to get boots on the ground and put in all that effort that goes into ground truthing, goes speaking to people. Because actually, you know, we can make some measurements and that'll do what it, and a lot of these things which are quite complicated, we don't have the luxury of that time to let things play out. We do need to get boots on the ground. And so I would just sort of caution against this rush to the sensor-dependent analytic environment that I can see we drive ourselves towards. We need to retain that boots on the ground. With that, we come more users. We can bring more people into the community if we've got more analytics, more understanding that comes from that, better decisions in terms of what we do. Another project we've done, we've mapped all of the fields in Afghanistan for the spring crop. The pink is poppy, the green is wheat, and yellow is other crops. There's orchards and vineyards in there as well. But importantly, your development response to that bunch, a highly dependent on opium, is going to be fundamentally different to that bunch, who are mostly growing wheat, and different again to that bunch, who have got a big smattering of yellow, which is other crops. I haven't had this before. This is the first time, despite 20 years of intervention in Afghanistan, anyone's had a national level crop map that is putting all the crops in the mix, not just one, but all of them. And that's really powerful. So we can have better decisions on that. But the issue is having intelligent users, because we're driving the agenda in the communities we're working to. We're telling them what it is they think that we think they need to know, which is not the way it really should be. And we really do need to do more to drive them and their understandings to be able to ask more intelligent questions of us. And linked to that is intelligent procurement. I come to my horse again. You'll go to an early market engagement with the government and they'll say, we want this. You know, we want lots of innovation, we want lots of EO, we want lots of GEO. The procurement document will come out and it'll say something like this. And in many cases, it's a race to the bottom to get that. And how is that, again, good enough? Because the procurement hasn't prioritized those value for money statements that EO can really bring. I think we all recognize and know that. I think my final challenge is about, these further evolutions. So speaking to the planets and the Maxars and the Satellogics and what the black skies and what's coming. It's exciting, right? It's amazing what's coming, and it's going to revolutionize all of that. What terrifies me is what it's going to do to that. You know, it has the potential to break it all, but equally, as it hasn't really started yet, there's actually a massive opportunity to really build on something from here. Any questions?
Thank you, Richard. Fascinating piece of work. Any questions from the audience?
The stuff you're talking about with the ground truthing, I was wondering, you're saying that the teams are more expensive, but is the knowledge there? Because I feel like some of the products you're talking about are different to what we would think of in normal academia ground truthing. We can validate what the sensor's seeing, the temperature, surface temperature, the radiance we're seeing, whether we're seeing vegetation there. Those we can validate. There are many efforts around the world, but is there actually the knowledge there to go to these more advanced products that's like in development and actually ground truth them? Because to my ears, it sounds more subjective. If you're asking, well, what are people doing here? The answer you might get from people on the ground might not neatly fit with the EO. So is it a matter that we don't have the teams, or we don't actually have the knowledge there to properly validate?
Thanks, Mike. Now I'll answer that in two parts. I think, to me, when I use the word ground truth, I mean it in two purposes. I mean that in terms of helping with the validation of the observations from imagery. That's one part of it. But I also mean it in terms of diving into the qualitative aspects of it, the why. So we can measure the what. We can see what has changed over time and have those measurements. But we lack those drivers. We lack the why. And so we need to get people into those communities to actually ask people about the phenomena that we're observing in terms of how that's played out and why that's played out. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Okay.
And I assume in your line of work, it does poses a lot of challenges because you work in conflict area. So how do you actually manage to get the people to do that kind of work, train the people to do that kind of work?
So that piece of work I showed you for the Foreign Office involved us using our partners who we worked with for the last 20 years, working across the now Taliban-controlled territories, and doing the drugs investigations, even with the prior administration and into the conflict space, into Talib and Daesh-controlled areas. We were able to get our surveyors to access and get inside drug laboratories, be them heroin labs or methamphetamine labs, and take georeference videos and photos. But they do that through a really lengthy and quite laborious relationship building process with local communities so that we can protect them and we can protect the people we're interviewing as well. There have been some notable instances of where we visited and then those labs have been blown up by coalition forces, and we've been blamed, or our surveyors have been blamed for that. We've had quite a bit of efforts in terms of community rebuilding to make it clear that that actually wasn't us. But in fact, you can see much of this activity from space as it happens anyway, and that's not happening. But yeah, there are great risks to it in terms of achieving access. There's risks in terms of the nature of the questions that you ask. That's often part of the challenge here if you're dealing with illicit economies. You can't just go in and say, do you grow opium? You'll say, no, of course not. You look out the field and it's like full of opium. It's like, yeah, of course you grow opium. And so, you can ask questions around, what's your livelihood strategies, what are you growing this year? And you can bring the conversations around to start talking about these more sensitive issues. But it takes time, and that's the cost now, is all that effort, which is quite extraordinary at times.
It's all about building trust to develop those collaboration and then make things happen at the end.
Yeah, we're going back to the same communities 10, 15 years later, still there's longitudinal interviews and household surveys so that we can keep on in terms of the shifting trends and patterns.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Now, for the first part of the session, I'll leave now the stage to Dan.
Thanks, Luca. So we're going to try and do something different, maybe a little bit controversial, engage the audience, get a bit of discussion going. So a lot of thought-provoking content from our speakers, and I wonder if we could try and continue that forward a little bit. So if you have questions, thoughts that you want to share, then please stick your hand up. But I think I'll kick off just by directing a question towards Mike and Jason, because I thought it was a really interesting example of a company working with an academic institution on something, and particularly jumping between your different segments on the slides, where we went from the big picture stuff to here's some technical bits about how it works. When it came to collaboration, how did that work practically? How did you translate some of those decisions around the very technical into the sort of use cases you were pursuing? And are there any sort of lessons learned there that you want to sort of share with the room?
It was terrible. No, I mean, we recognise that obviously probably work at different paces. Academia probably works at a different pace to maybe commercial organisation. But I think that's important. You've got to recognise that there are competing priorities in this. The aim of it really was to get the data. That was what we were both invested in, was that data and getting it out. So I think we had a common aim, which was important. But I think it proved to us that we can, as a commercial organisation, work with academia. There is value there. And I think as a country, as a globe, we've got some really big challenges ahead of us. And they're not going to be solved by individual organisations necessarily. They're going to be solved by some of this collaboration work. So I think it's really about building a relationship. We've got a pretty good relationship, personal relationships, being able to understand, the people you're working with. That's really important. I don't know what you thought, Mike.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I'd also say that there was a large degree of realizing exactly why we needed OS in this case. So for instance, OS were really amazingly flexible in the fact that we were turning over academic data and you're able to look at it, understand it, and give us some feedback on exactly what we want. So this is one of the breaks that we would have ordinarily if we were trying to go directly to users, that we turn over a data set academically, we're like, oh yes, it's great. And we wouldn't have that ability to have the feedback. Whereas the fact that OS were very flexible to looking into it, but also very honest in the feedback about it, it just meant that we could get the feedback, turn the data into something more useful and keep bringing it back. And it really shows why you need that in-between stage, well, in my view, from the academics to the users, because some of the changes we wouldn't have even thought of, but you get that feedback early, and being able to talk to somebody who's not the end user makes it a lot less confrontational. If there's a problem with the data, you need to change this. That's not the client saying change this, it's the person you're working with saying we could improve it, and that's really important.
Very interesting. Are there any other perspectives in the room? Yeah, please.
Oh, sorry, this was a separate question to that. So,
Oh, well, go ahead.
Oh, it was, this is more for Richard. Not. So it was just to say that taking it back to that wonderful artistic drawing of the horse. So it was in terms of accuracy versus resolution. So the question that I first had was somewhat answered, where do you make that compromise between having something very high resolution, but with a lot of data products out there, as soon as you take it down to a much more zoomed in version, you see that the quality within the actual product isn't what you expected. But then there was a mention of collaboration. So how do both sides, in terms of maybe the companies pushing out that data and then the other organizations, collaborate in order to understand where that should really be? So being from a company that pushes a ridiculous amount of data, this is something I've been asking questions about. So it'd be good to get a perspective on that.
Richard,
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's that question of the resolution is going to give us the answer that we are seeking to understand. So it's if you want to see whether there's an activity at a location, you want a different resolution to if you want to actually try and measure that activity. And so the challenge for us is always that first sort of kick around session, saying, what is it we actually really, properly really want to know? So that then we can get the task collections or the dive into the archives at the appropriate resolution. I think but it's not always just about spatial resolution. I mean, the temporal resolution brings a whole other dimension. And one of the things we've really struggled with is how do we use the planet 3-meter imagery? Because that's phenomenal in terms of their monthly text, so that the monthly products. So you can see that shift and change. But we're used to using it a 0.5 meter imagery, but that's at 3. So we've had to have that sort of resolution shift in our mind. But we can certainly answer questions at the good enough level using the meter than it would if we had to try and do the same work using 50 centimeters. So there's no hard and fast to that.
Jeff, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I was going to follow up on Richard's presentation. I thought it was a great presentation. But when you got to the end and you said the intelligent customers or intelligent users that we're aiming for, I think sometimes we see it as we have to educate them to in-earth observation. But I think sometimes it's getting them to understand the processes that they already have in place and what the costs and constraints of those are. And then how does an earth observation solution fit into that? I guess I'm asking the question myself, to the room, but Richard has commented on that's a good question.
So just I had a conversation with a company in Argentina who shared with me the materials that they have been using in schools, using satellite imagery to teach, well, to use as foundational inputs to the teaching that they do. And they're illustrating how from Buenos Aires, we like to night day to show how in the days of horses and carts, that was a day distance to travel with a horse and a cart. I mean, genius, right? So we kind of think that we've got to train people technically. I think there's two dimensions. There's bringing people through sets of lives, and also I think what's revolutionized itself over the last 10, 15 years is that you don't need in companies that deep level of technical skills that were needed before when we were doing 3D stuff. And the software is there. And so when it's about building intelligent customers, I don't think they need to understand about the satellites in space and how you do stuff. It's actually knowing how to ask the right questions to get results that are reasonable, that will answer the challenges that they see.
Is that a comment or a question?
A comment on what has just been said. What I think is happening here, I don't think we need to educate the customer necessarily. A bit like Richard said, there is, I think, a role for an intermediate layer, for someone or an organization in between that can operate, that they can translate, that do the knowledge transfer from a community, the one of Earth observation that is driven by technology, that innovate most often through technology, produce data, produce new sensors, sometimes without even asking why am I collecting all this data. And another community, which is the industry, which is driven by solving a problem, solving a challenge, and therefore approach innovation in a very different way. They ask a question, they don't care where the data comes from Earth observation. For that is data, what they want is the intelligence. So there is an opportunity in the business support of someone in between that can operate at scale this kind of function.
Jackson, I think you.
Yeah, very much related to that, and picking up on the comment you made, Richard, about the vast sums of money that are spent on overseas development systems by many developed nations. That is spent on organisations that should be that intermediary. I'm sure everyone in this room would. It's obvious to all of us what value Earth observation can bring to those sorts of contexts. So what is missing? What do we need to do to persuade the powers that be that this is a valuable resource that can be used in that context? But there have been attempts like the IPP program, and ESA's tried to do ODA related stuff, but they're not really taken off in any big way. And often they've been more painful than they're good to execute.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to pick up on your if you want to go ahead.
No, please.
My question is related to what you said. So in your presentation, you said a couple of times that we are in the early ages of the Earth observation business. We are very at the beginning, something like that. We have not fully developed the market. The market is in a very
For the public sector.
For the public sector, it's great.
Yeah.
It's and you mentioned things that, for example, there are data, there are models, there are access to the data and so on. But the fact is, all those things have improved a lot in the past 20, 25, 30 years. We have much better data. we have much better models, not to talk about technology, which has just, huge. So why are we still talking about educating end users, convincing communities, trying to demonstrate how amazing the data is? How are we? How come? Why are we so in the early ages? Why are we going so slowly? What's happening? What's going on?
We don't have a national space program.
No, but this is more than many countries. It's not the UK. This is the in general.
Because with technology, it's trying to find a problem. We need to speak to the users about their problems first,
So
and then try and match the two.
imagine this conversation 20 years ago. We would have said the same. I think hearing the same thing many years. I don't see changes. I don't see.
So we'll go to Richard, Jason, Kevin.
Great
And
question.
then,
I guess my response to that is apart from a huge amount of frustration, you probably said this earlier, but my example to this is if my company is doing work for the US government, and we do a lot of work for the USAID, we get full access to their enhanced vision license, which means we get full access to Maxar, Planet, Black Skies, imagery archive, going back 10, 15, 20 years. But not global. Well, it's those countries where we've got programs here. Phenomenal, right? But yet, if I'm bidding for UK government work, I've got to put a budget imagery license, budget for imagery procurement in it. And I look at it and I go, wow, oh, how much? It's expensive. You know, we can't even get over that. So why hasn't the UK government got the US government equivalent? This is absolutely bonkers that we haven't got a national government framework agreement with the imagery industry. And if we did that, then at least that is one of the biggest hurdles to get over to get them access to this stuff and reduce the cost of engagement with it. That's my 10 pence.
thanks, Richard. So Jason, then Kevin.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. For any of these comments, I think they're great. I think, talking about that intermediary piece, that was what we were trying to actually test when we did our piece of work. Is we recognize that the customer's not always going to want the imagery. They don't know how to use the imagery. So what can we order a survey with all our geospatial engineers and data scientists? Can we do all that under the bonnet lifting and just give people what they need? They don't need to know what satellites come from, or Mike's very complicated diagram up there. They're not interested. I'm sorry, Mike, but they're not interested in that. They're interested in just what they want to get out of it. I want to know whether this road's hotter 9 times a year. That's it. That's what they want. So I think that was the first step, the first toe in the water. Now that's gone to the UK Space Agency, that report. And hopefully those insights will help drive that conversation further.
Yeah, just some observations. I think of the commercialization engine. And they were surprised that first engagement were with companies with no prime PO, because you assume there's some SMEs looking to commercialize a product and trying to utilize the expertise. That was quite interesting. I've got a couple of projects working overseas countries, Nigeria, Indonesia, about UK. Also a Mentai project. So EO is getting out there. I think what you need to do is start with a phase 1, build a concept. Phase 2 is about thinking about delivering a product for a range of users. We've got biofuels in Africa. We need to detect harvest of different crops, and it turns out we can also characterize different crop types. And then phase 3, we've just been funded. This project is all about developing a product that the user can interact with through a cloud-based service. And at the University of Leicester, I think one massive change that's coming in the next few years is 2 years ago we launched an MSc in satellite data science. The first year with no marketing, 10 students, mostly from the UK. Current year just finishing, about 70 students. Next year, predicted starting in September, could be up to 90 students, many of them on with industry. So there's this whole group of people coming through, and
I think it touches upon I'm a geographer, so I naturally feel I have to go into the field to collect field measurements, either for calibration or parameterization of a solution or for validation. More and more, we're starting to talk a lot with computer scientists interested in deep learning. I think we just have to make sure that. So I was going to ask Richard, what kind of profile of graduate they employ at Alkis, whether they now more look for a computer scientist or they look for a geographer who can at least start to answer the question of why are things changing, not just a data solution, but an information solution. And that's what we want to try and create with our MSc group, not just somebody who's going to code in Python and push an end-to-end solution through, but people who can identify extremes, write good interfaces to display the data and transform that data into information. That's going to be our challenge, because we've never taught large groups of students before. And suddenly satellite data science is becoming very, very attractive. And I'm going to be trying to reach out to many companies, because I'm in charge of helping the students get placements with industry, 3 to 12 months. It's going to be a difficult job managing their expectations, also the expectations from companies. So yeah, we'll have a chat with me tomorrow, later on tonight, if you think your company will benefit from some of these students, because they're coming through the door and there's going to be too many of them to, I'm just worried about my marking load now. Christmas, because they each do a coursework report. But the great things here, less we just trying to deal with planning. We get 10 terabytes of data. We've got good deals with Amazon Web Services and the cloud providers. So we're having to now build an infrastructure for these students, not just to work in a black box on our HPC, but work more on ideas that and prototypes that could be of use for some business.
Yeah, thanks, guys. It's an interesting kind of way of addressing the problem we're discussing, of getting new skills into the workforce. You know, these people aren't necessarily all going to go and work in EO companies. Hopefully, some of them will go and work in other sorts of organisations. So, was there a comment or a question on that?
It was a comment earlier. It's fine. I was just making a general observation of. I used to work in the commercial world for a weather forecasting company, and I felt like the more data we had and the better data we had, that there was an apprehension to take responsibility for that data. It seemed like they wanted to know the information, but didn't want to actually have to act on it. So there is, I was just going to ask Richard, do you feel like from a policy or a public sector perspective that maybe there is an apprehension of having that information to actually have to act on it? So maybe, yeah, we want all this information, great, really, high resolution, but then what are we going to do with it now? Kind of now we have it, so maybe that was just on the horse.
Yeah, a comment from that, with a lot of the corporates that we engage actually have that point of view. If we know it's happening, we have to do something.
Exactly.
I don't know if you wanted to respond.
I mean, that is a brilliantly insightful question. We agonized hugely in terms of that Foreign Office report I showed you, because that was publicly released, hence the media interest in the pickup, but we couldn't show the underlying evidence. If you look, you'll just find a 10-page report. You won't find the underlying imagery because it's integrated with fieldwork, which would then compromise the workers who went to collect the data, so we couldn't share that. But linked to that is then the follow-on work we're starting. And I said to them, with the start of this new work, that we're now, with the available imagery that we will draw from, we will provide them a level of insight in terms of dynamics inside Afghanistan that has never been done before. I've already shown you some of that, but that's going to be integrated with other stuff. But that is going to be world's leading insight, and it's going to be provided to them. And what are they then going to do with it? And that's that whole point about when they receive stuff, what are they going to do? Because that needs to go to all the donors, and there are multiple donors into this one country, as well as implementers who are also seeking to fund things. You need to educate and inform and use this data for that. And there are sensitivities there. The point is, the analysis is going to be at a level that they've never received before. And just my question to them on Friday is, how are you going to receive, manage, and communicate this across your stakeholder group? And we'll work through that in the next 6 months.
Shia, I don't know if you want to comment from your perspective, the levels of information that you were presenting that you can serve to customers. What is the feedback you're getting from the market?
think for them, like I said, I mean, they're not too concerned about where the data comes from, what sort of data we're using, as long as we're answering or helping them answer or push them along that pathway to helping them answer that question. So yeah, I mean, for us, it really doesn't matter what data it is that we use at all, for as long as it helps what question we're trying to answer.
There was a question. Was it a comment or a question?
It's more a comment on the public sector piece. So don't throw things at me, but I used to be civil servant. I've moved on now. But yeah, I think cultural change is a big thing to try and overcome in that kind of sector, because we've done things a certain way, why change them now? So the risk appetite is lower as well. So it's actually taking that kind of leap of faith almost and trying to do something that industry doing in the public sector. And yeah, completely agree with the framework imagery. I can't tell you the amount of times that I know that two separate departments have paid the same image separately. When you think, come on, why isn't this in place and share it around? Yeah, just want that much sense. Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, just to build on that, and the point that a number of people have made, and one of the reasons why it's so good working with OS on this is having that platform where the data is available for people to be able to access who you haven't necessarily courted directly for their individual user application. Because maybe controversially, I don't actually think that the scientific researcher should always speak to the users, because I think that gets very complicated quite quickly. I've been to a lot of agricultural conferences where the farmers will tell me they want 50 centimetre resolution every 15 minutes. And then you ask them what they're asking for, and they want the general kind of soil moisture for drought indicators. And that you could do that with 3 kilometre data on a daily basis, and you would get almost no benefit. But if you were just getting a project fed by the individual users, it can get quite daunting and not always answer the question that they want answered. So I think having somebody in the middle who is experienced with managing users and then can communicate with scientific research is really important, so that every side gets what they actually want rather than what they might think they should have or should be providing based on their own background.
Luca?
I just want to add another couple of cents to, but on the question of financing and funding, because I think that is what often catalyzes innovation around the technology or market. And I think Earth observation in the curve of adoption is as fast, but there's still a lot of work to do, but as fast the tech-driven innovation approach. We already have a lot of data. We already have a lot of satellites. We need to start investing on the downstream, on what we're going to do with the data, how we make sense of all this data that is coming down to us, how we're building the infrastructure to manage this data and deliver this data. In the Earth observation, nobody talks about API. I was quite happy that there was a slide on API. That is in a software, that is the standard. This is how you deliver data. You move data around in intelligence. In Earth observation, we don't talk about that. And that should be one of the most important standards to agree upon across all operators, so that data can be moved around. But in terms of financing, that's where, I mean, public sector funding should start looking not just at the pilot project, at the use cases, at the let's prove and demonstrate that we can use the technology. We need to start moving and funding. We did the pilot, how we scale this pilot and we make it a product that is sustainable over time and can be commercialized across an industry. And now we do that in vertical specific industry so that we address specific problem or specific customers. And I think we need to start looking at the model in which we fund the technology much better.
Thanks, Luca. Yeah, clearly more focused towards industrializing those technologies and enabling the markets in order to mature the sector in general. We've got a hard stop at 5, so I guess final comments.
Yeah, a very small addition to what Luca said. I just agree with your point of view. I think if there is in changing this space, going to the next phase, it's very important that the public sector introduces the need for Earth observation in the legislation, in the regulations. So if there is a procurement to be a sentence, an indication saying this has to be done with the Earth observation. This could be. So that would help behind the pilot.
Potential pilot there, still on, last comment.
It's just a reference really, so if anybody wants to read about the UK Space Agency HEAT project, it's all public, it's all online, so just search up UK Space Agency HEAT data project, and you should get to the report which talks around, you know, the collaboration, the investigation we do with the customers as well.
Brilliant, thanks. So I'm not going to try and summarise that discussion because it was wide and far-reaching. I hope that you found it useful and insightful. Thanks again to our presenters, fantastic